Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, and we have time and time again had such great authors, and we actually have a local person here today, Paul Bolanek from San Francisco Law, which is a new name, right, for the law school here at San Francisco, at the UC Law School in San Francisco. It used to be called Hastings. And he has written a book on Rome, and it's about restraint, conflict, and what happened in Rome as a result of the culture of restraint. Now, it's kind of funny, and I thought it really a great topic because, how often does restraint come up in our culture? It's not like an ideal of ours to be restrained. About the only places in art, if you're a really good actor and you're emotionally restrained, it's more powerful. That's about one of the few examples we have where we know what the power of restraint is. But the power of restraint held the Roman Republic together for many, many years, many, many, many years. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about sort of what was the same and what was not the same about then and now. So thank you very much for joining us, Paul.
Thank you very much, George.
And thanks for writing about this. Perfect timing for an election year for it to come out. So first, how did you decide to study this topic? You mentioned that it was your PhD thesis, so how did you decide that that was what you wanted to work on?
Wow, what a great question. So it started off life as a PhD dissertation because I went to lunch one day with my PhD advisor, and she said, and we'll probably get into this, she said, we know that the Roman Republic runs on competition, like a car. That's its gas. What makes it stop? Like what keeps it from going off the rails? And I sat there, I was like, wow, that's a really good question. I have no idea. And she said, why don't you go write about that? And so I sat down and started thinking about it and started just reading, and started making lists of like what stops people from doing stuff they want to do. You read these old stories the Romans tell, and they will say, someone wants to do something bad. What keeps him from doing the bad thing? Is it threat of physical punishment? Is he going to go to jail? Is it going to, what is it that's stopping him from doing it?
And this was before hell, right?
Yeah, it's before hell, right. No, that's a really good point, right? Yeah. One of the things that is not the answer is nobody ever says the gods will punish you. Right. That just doesn't happen. So that's a different story from many cultures and religious beliefs. And so you ask yourself, what is stopping them from doing what they want? Because they're human, right? They want to do things that are going to be antisocial and selfish and stuff. And what you see over and over again is appeal to a certain set of values. And the values are things like, you're not acting well, you should be more moderate. You should be more temperate. You should be more modest, right? And when we hear these words, they sound to us a lot like moral virtues, right? Well, I'm going to get ahead of the game a little, and I think what happened was that Christianity picked up these values in the ancient sources and then sort of turned them into personal values. The book argues that these are not personal values. These are political values. In Rome, when you say be modest, it is a political virtue that allows you to function inside of their society and inside of their political structures. So what's going on here? We've got social norms that direct how people act inside of a political system. And I can expand off that a little bit, but that's how it all got started.
Yep. Very interesting. It's a very interesting. I think we can't understand, especially a lot of people are very interested in how is America compared to Rome? What can we learn from Rome, the Republic, being in place for 450 some years, something like that. That's what we'd like to do with our democracy, but we are always worried that we're going to lose it, et cetera. And how did they do it? How can we learn from that? But there's a big, big difference. And one of those big differences is the basic cultural ideals, as you just mentioned. And if you say, these, as you said, the moral values that are picked up, you see in all the writings, and you focus on that a little bit too. When they say you should not lust, they don't say lust is a sin. They say if you do too much of it, you lose sight of you lose sight of your restraint. And if you lose sight of your restraint on that, we can't trust you in this. But if you do a little bit, and Rome a little bit was a lot for now, that's okay. It was not a problem, right? It's not a social problem, basically.
I think when you say, if you do this, we can't trust you, finishing that sentence really makes the point of the book. It's can't trust you to do what? Right. And the answer is participate in government. Because if you're the kind of person who has fancy dinners, if you're the kind of person who can't control himself, we can't trust you to hold a government office. Now, why? Okay, now here we've got to back up a little bit to understand the culture values. So I think of this book kind of in 4 steps. And step 1 is where we started with that conversation with my advisor. So this whole book starts with the question, why Rome? Like, why does this little village on the Tiber River end up conquering everything from Scotland to the Euphrates? Why? Okay, why as opposed to anybody else, right? And the answer people have come up with, there's a lot of answers, but the big answer is that Rome has this really peculiar cultural trait. Its aristocracy is hyper-competitive with each other in a way that no other ancient people are. If you conquer 3 barbarian villages, your son had better get 4 or he's a failure to the family. This is in their houses. When you walk into a Roman house as a young boy, the death masks of all of your ancestors are on the wall of the entryway with a little plaque underneath each mask saying like what this guy did. At a funeral of a relative, there's a giant parade where everyone wears the death masks and gives speeches saying, I am so-and-so's great-grandfather and I did these awesome things, I conquered these people and I did. So you can see there's this strange competitive, the other example I point out is, how many of you have ever been to Athens? How many of you have ever been to Rome? Okay, in Athens, whenever you look at a building, it's beautiful, it's very nice. In Rome, when you look at a building, it's got somebody's name slapped on it. You don't see that in Athens. That is a physical trace of a cultural trait, which is, see this awesome thing I did, everybody look at me. So it's unusual in the ancient world, right? So you have this extreme hyper-competitiveness. This, of course, is what drives competition and what drives empire. One guy conquers this much, everyone else has to get a little more, a little more, a little more, and that's why the empire expands. That's why Rome as opposed to any other village. Okay, but then step 2, right? If everything is competition, why don't they just start killing each other immediately? Like, why 450 years of actually running a republic functionally? And this is where the restraint stuff comes in. Think of, many of you may have heard the story, the legend of Cincinnatus. Okay, if you don't, the people of Cincinnati may know this story. This is George Washington's favorite story too. Cincinnatus is a Roman nobleman. He's out plowing his farm. He's by himself, by the way. He's very humble, right? He's his own farm. And an enemy is approaching. And so the Senate comes to him and says, Cincinnatus, would you please be our dictator, be our general, the dictator? And he says, okay, I'll be the dictator. And so he goes off and he conquers the enemy. And then he goes back and he says, I'm no longer dictator, I quit. And he goes back to his farm and just keeps plowing. Now, whether or not this is true, I have no idea. But it doesn't matter. What matters is we can learn from the legends that a culture tells us about what the culture values. So they hold this up as exemplary behavior. But don't you see what a restrained man he is? He gives up space to other people. He's humble. He doesn't have riches. He doesn't have wealth. So this is the ideal. But if you run a government like this, a republic, it actually works. You see why? A king doesn't need to be modest or restrained. He's the boss. But if you want to run a system where there's no king, you have to make space for everyone to have a chance. So you have to inculcate the value that I must step aside in order for other people to have a chance. So you tell the boys, what? Legends like this one. So they learn that's proper behavior.
So you're saying basically that whether or not the Cincinnati story is an accurate one doesn't matter as long as it's held up as an ideal, sort of the way the cherry tree and the chopping down the cherry tree is.
Exactly. What kind of society tells a story about young George Washington who cannot tell a lie?
Right.
It's one that, can I pause on this for a minute?
Sure, go right
this
ahead.
Is so much fun. It's one that expects children to obey their parents.
Right.
It's one that expects children to be truthful. And this one's always funny to me. It's one that has absolutely no problem with 8-year-olds wandering around with axes unaccompanied. Nobody thinks this is weird, right? George's dad is not like, George, what are you doing with the axe? George's dad says, why did you chop down my tree? Right? That's what he's concerned about. So the story tells us something about the culture. And what does it tell us? It tells us they believe, truly believe, that in order to run a republic, you need to have people who are morally upright. Now again, whether we think this is true is irrelevant. Whether they think it's true is the most important point, because they convince themselves of it.
Well, one of the big points, of course, is that an oligarchy, which it was, needs to, all the members of the oligarchy need to trust each other.
Yes.
Right? So one of my favorite things about trust is if you go back to the George W. Bush administration in the cabinet, the first 4 years. And in the cabinet, who were the trusted members. If you just go by, who's trusted in the administration by the public, and everybody is under 40 points on that score, whether they're trustworthy or not, except for one person, Colin Powell. Colin Powell is in the 60s, something like that. That doesn't mean he's perfectly trustworthy, but he's trusted by the people. They're not. So what do? They kind of set him up to put him in a situation. And why is it that oligarchies do that? It's not that the honorable people are the ones that are trusted. It's the ones that they can trust to work along with them to accomplish their goals.
Right.
And so if someone is too honest or too principled so that they might pull the curtain down on what they're doing, they don't trust them and they're not part of the thing. So I think that that's an important part of it, because when people talk about trust in a Christian culture, they think about this just kind of an honest, trusting, and the person must be virtuous and so on. You can trust a bank robber to do a good job if he's got good skills at being a bank robber, right? So it's a slightly different version. So sorry, I wanted to...
No, that's very well put, which means that what the trust we're talking about is the trust that if you and I are both nobles, and if we run for office, I trust that you're going to stick around for a year and then you'll step down to give me a chance. And you trust that I would do the same with you. These values that we think about, modesty and moderation and temperance, all that we feel are personal, again, it's political. It's what allows the system to actually run. I should step back a second. I'm sorry. How does Roman government run? This is step 3. Roman government runs basically like this. Every year you have elections. There are multiple offices to be filled. The top 2 are called consuls. They command the military, and they go off in different directions and conquer different people. The next bunch down are called praetors. They handle judicial matters. Then there's a next bunch down that handle taxes and finances. And of course, it's younger the further you go down. You kind of work your way up the ladder, right? None of this is written down. There's no constitution. The age limits that I just talked about a moment, they're put into law like 350 years after the Republic is formed. For 350 years, it's done by tradition. This is like the British Constitution, right? It's all traditional, it's not written down. How do you make a traditional agreement work? Well, you have to have a bunch of people who trust that it can work. What's the only way you can make them trust that it can work? You inculcate in their brains, since the time they're little boys, that there's a proper manner of behavior. And then you say to them, and if anyone steps out of this proper manner of behavior, they will hurt the Republic very badly, and they're bad people. Okay? Now, for a long time, if someone steps out of line, and of course they're human, so people occasionally do, how do you stop the bad behavior? Remember I asked, how do you stop? The number one way they do it is actually they form a physical group of noblemen. They walk up to the malfeasant, physically look at him in the face and say, "You're acting badly. You're being a bad person. You need to stop, okay? And you should be ashamed of yourself." And repeatedly in the sources, the person goes, "You're right, I'm sorry." And they describe, he put his head down and began to weep. Right? This happens multiple times. Again, whether it's true, I don't know, but the ideal is that this is supposed to be the proper response if you're a bad person and you've been corrected. And then they say, okay, you've been corrected, you can come back into the fold now. So they build this entire model of governance, believing that personal behavior is necessary to it. Now, I hope you can all see the problem. If you say, my system of government functions only when everyone acts morally, what's the predicate? You're terrified of someone acting immorally. Because they're not just a bad person, they're going to bring the whole thing down. Do you see how the seeds of moral panic are now available to us? That's a problem.
Yeah. You have a great thesis in your book that a lot of people, when they look at Rome, they say that the wealth that was brought in after they conquered Carthage and everything made the families too greedy and et cetera. But greed is a relative function of how greedy, how rich everybody else is. And so I think you point out very well that that's probably not the impetus of the failure. The impetus is that the pressure from this restraint culture began to cause fissures instead of pull things together. So very interesting thesis. So it's too bad we don't have time for all of Roman history here.
I know.
Because it's very interesting.
Everyone sit down. This may take a while.
So, but why don't you talk about, so it's been going on fairly well, with lots of problems, but, and one of the points that you mentioned about how if someone was reproved by everyone else, that they would hang their heads in shame and maybe even cry. And some of that probably was performative, and not so sincere, but they had to fit within a certain framework to continue to be trusted. So, and that went on for a long time without almost without much violence, not no violence, but without much violence.
I would say none. I mean,
None.
there is no political violence that we know of between 509 BC, when the Republic is founded, and 133 BC. No assassinations, no mob rule, no nothing, none of that. It's incredible if you think about it.
No, we haven't done that well.
Yeah.
Not even close. Okay, so so the first kind of crack. Why don't you tell a little bit of the story about the crack of the Gracchus?
The first crack. So as I said, you have a system of government where you believe, and everyone believes, that proper moral behavior is necessary to get the Republic to run. You've sown the seeds for moral panic, right? So what happens inevitably in human affairs when we can no longer quite define what proper behavior is, especially as things start to change, right? You mentioned a lot of money starts flowing into Rome with all of their conquests. Moreover, generals, before, when they conquered things, they'd go off to some part of Italy and then they come back, and it was a very quick sort of thing. Now they're away for years, and when they conquer things, it's like Greece, right? It's not 2 barbarian villages, it's enormous. There's a great story that one of the generals comes back with so much money from his conquest that the citizens of Italy do not pay taxes for 130 years.
It's like being in Alaska, right, with all the oil.
I mean, could you imagine, right? An American general goes off and comes back and says, all right, everybody, no income tax for the next century and a quarter, right? Wouldn't that be great? That's the kind of level of wealth that is now poured in. And it's inevitable that when people see that, they start to say, not look at all that wealth. They start to say, maybe he's a lustful sort of guy. Maybe he's not trustworthy. Maybe that general is a little bit too powerful. Maybe he's not really moderate the way he's supposed to be, right? You can see that beginning of that moral panic. So you mentioned the Gracchi brothers. The moment of crack, the first bit of violence, is a young nobleman of a very, very wealthy and powerful family, and he begins to look around. He sees some problems in Rome, and one is that the urban poor have started to proliferate a little bit. And this is because wealthy landowners in Italy have started taking a lot of land for themselves, and the people who used to be on that land are now out of a job, and they have to come to Rome, and now they don't have jobs. And he looks around and he says, now, an economist would look at this and say supply and demand and all things, but as a Roman, how does he view it? It's a moral issue, right? It has to be because there are greedy and luxurious people out there being greedy and luxurious, and we have to stop them. Who are the greedy and luxurious people? Well, they're very wealthy senators, as it turns out. So here's this young man accusing wealthy senators of being greedy, immoral people, and we know what happens when there are immoral people afoot. The Republic is about to fall. But here's the token. By the same look, the senators look at him and say, young man, that is out of place. You are getting above your station. You are immoderate and immodest. And that's the sort of person who would destroy the Republic. So now you've got both sides morally panicking and saying, not just I disagree with you on policy, but you're an immoral and bad person, and we know what that spells, until the argument reaches an absolute head. And Tiberius Gracchus, he pushes a law that would strip the senators of their excess land. They're not supposed to have a certain amount. They are having a certain amount. And he pushes it until he reaches the point where one of his colleagues is trying to veto it. He removes his colleague from office, and then the Senate panics and says he's broken all of the rules of modesty and immoderation. And his own cousin, who is another senator, says, everyone follow me if you want to save the Republic. They rush out into the square. There are benches around for the day of voting. They smack up the benches against the ground, they turn it into clubs, they attack him, they beat him and his followers to death and throw their bodies into the river. This is the moment where violence first meets the Roman Republic, and the impetus is the belief that this is an immodest and immoral man. And that's the first start, because now violence is in the game. And once that happens, what happens to trust? Can you really trust that anyone else is going to have your best interest, not best interest, but is going to play the game fair? Or is it time to maybe start arming yourself? And that's where we've got a real problem.
Yeah. So his younger brother, 10 years later, adds to the crack.
His younger brother's a little understandably miffed about his older brother's murder at the hands of all these senators, and he starts to cry even louder. The senators are immoral, they're luxurious, they're terrible people, they don't even care about the rules. And he attacks them even more strongly. He's multiple laws that he passes to strip them of various powers. Ultimately, the consul does the exact same thing. He calls out some troops. showers Gaius' supporters with arrows, and then chases after him with a mob, and here he is, getting stabbed to death. And so the next brother dies. And by this point, it's very obvious that violence is going to be part of the system from here on out. Almost immediately after this, one of the, I'm sorry, I back up a second. There's a job called a censor, where we get the word censorship from. One of their jobs is to kick bad people out of the Senate for being immoral. And one of the censors says, we're going to kick out the bad people who allied themselves with Gaius Gracchus. The bad people are now, so-called, they're not willing to be censored. They say, no, you're the bad guy for attacking us. And one of them actually orders his guys, his slaves, to grab the man, the censor, and throw him off of a cliff. And in that moment, there's a moment of panic, and other people have to get involved. They have to be physically separated. But it's very obvious that now violence is part of the mix. And Gaius, heats it up. And so I think from here on, and this is the whole second half of the book, is watching the moral panic get worse and worse and worse. With both sides, there's not a both sides, there's an all sides. Everyone accusing everyone else of being an immoral person on the verge of destroying the Republic. Full moral panic mode.
Yeah, and I don't want to draw too tight a parallel between Rome and America, but I thought it was fascinating that the Gracchus brothers' names were John and Robert.
Well, be that as it may. No, I said to you before when we were discussing, the tagline of this book is, the narrative of decline can be self-fulfilling. If you believe the country is going to hell in a handbasket, as the Gaius and Tiberius, the brothers did, as the senators did as they watched the brothers, as people down the line believe, you might make panicked and freaked out decisions that actually end up fraying the social fabric worse than it would have been, until bit by bit you actually bring about the result that you didn't want.
So let's bring it right down to today then on that big issue, because I think that's a really good point about your book. The ability to compromise and have two parties and to argue with each other and then come out with a compromise on most issues is a crucial part of the functioning of any kind of system that's not run by one authoritarian, right? And there have been times of worse and not so cooperative, et cetera, before, but rarely have both parties just been saying, you Republicans are not democratic. You're not in favor of democracy. You're trying to overthrow our democracy. And the Republicans saying to the Democrats, no, you're the ones who are trying to overthrow the democracy by taking our leader and putting him through courts. And so they both are using the same kind of more extreme arguments. And so one of my questions is, you talk about the arc of history and the arc of Roman history moving in this direction. Where on the arc of deterioration does that place us?
I always like to say we're not Rome, but we might be. Our founders were very intentional. They looked at the problems of Rome and they said, let's figure out how we can set up structures to avoid this. Federalism and separation of powers and these very important things that keep. Remember, Roman government is not constitutional in the sense ours is. It really is just a gentleman's agreement to run a system where people take turns in office. But the gentleman's agreement can be undone by a lack of trust. We're a little bit more structurally settled, and I think that's a good thing. So I don't panic exactly as much. But where we are in the arc is we're not at the point of constant violence the way the Romans got themselves to. They got to the point where, there's a point in my book where I say, prior to the Gracchi brothers, there simply isn't violence. It just doesn't happen. And then afterwards, there's a riot and then I list like 17 years in a row, there are riots every single year, passing laws, doing whatever it is, there's mob violence almost constantly. We're not there, and that's a wonderful thing. What gets you there, though, is the moment where you say to the other person, it's not just that I disagree with you on a policy, it's that I think you're an actively wicked person who wants to destroy the Republic, and therefore I must defeat you at all costs. That's the dangerous moment, the point of inflection. Because that's when the violence is the very next step, right? What do you do? There's
no other solution to that issue.
And as I write in the book, like these people, the Romans convinced themselves that if immoral people are on the verge of destroying the Republic, there's no other option other than to kill them. It's not good enough to send them to the censors, to get in trouble. You can't walk up to them and say, now you're acting badly, please stop, okay? That's not working anymore, because that's a key part to the book too. When someone used to hang their head in shame, Now they're responding, how dare you judge me? You're a bunch of bad people, right? And so you have no way you can shame me. I don't listen to you. And then what is the solution? There isn't one. Now the Romans, of course, were perfectly adept at applying horrific violence to other people for hundreds and hundreds of years. Once they learned to do it to themselves, what stops that ball from rolling? And the answer is practically nothing.
Yeah. So after that period of time, we move forward to the time of Sulla, Catiline, so on and so forth. So we can talk about that. And is Cicero an observer of that period of time, or he's later, right?
Cicero's a little later.
Later than that.
Catiline, yes.
Yeah.
Sulla, Cicero was a young man. He was a
Right.
teenager at that time.
Okay.
Sulla is the worst of the violence before the actual end. Sulla is a general. He started off life as an impoverished son of a noble house that had spent all of its money. He grew up in the company of actors with a very sort of vivacious life, but wanted something noble for himself. So he went off and had a military career, rose through the ranks and expected good things for himself. His opponent in the world was a guy named Gaius Marius, who was a peasant from the middle of Italy, who also rose through the ranks and expected great things of himself, the higher and higher he got. And as it happened, one of the great accidents of history is that just as Gaius Marius finally reached the consulship, and everyone expected, oh, this is nice, he'll be consul for a year and then farewell to you, a group of German barbarians went over the borders, invaded Italy, and he spent the next 6 years defeating them, every year becoming consul over and over and over again. It's like, imagine somebody being president for 4 or 5 terms in a row because we're attacking some external enemy, right? So he has a very high opinion of himself, and he does not want to be challenged. These two butt heads, and eventually the moment comes where one of them, Sulla, gets a command. He's going to go attack Asia Minor, which will be very lucrative and powerful for him. Gaius Marius says, I want that command. I'm the greatest man in Rome, it's mine. And he has the people pass a law giving it to him instead. Sulla is furious. He believes that Gaius Marius is, get ready, immodest, immoral, uncontrolled, intemperate. He should be done. He had his chance. He's had his 5, 6 terms. He should be finished. Where's my turn? Why didn't you make space for me? He orders his army to come and march on Rome. Now we're past mob violence. It's an army attacking fellow Romans.
And what's their age difference? Is there an age difference?
Marius was much older. He's probably 15, 20 years older.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit less than that, maybe 15 or so. So that's the other thing, is that Marius is saying, young man, this is my place, right? And Sulla is saying, old man, you've had your time.
Right.
But because there's no structural control here, the only control is what the people vote for. And you can kind of, you can bribe your way into that if you really want. The attack, again, this is an immoral attack on how the Republic is supposed to function. And then the real horror begins. Sulla begins slaughtering all of his political enemies in the streets. Hundreds of people die in just a liquidation of his enemies. He goes off to the east. He's there for a little bit of while. While he's gone, Marius comes back with his army. And he liquidates all of Sulla's people and vice versa. And it just... the violence just spills and spills and spills. You
mentioned something about the people voting, and I think maybe it's useful. It wasn't a democracy, but it's useful to say what role did the people have in the Republic?
Yes.
They voted at different times about different things, or at least gave their assent, and was collected in different ways. But why don't you say a little bit about how much influence the masses had?
Absolutely. I made a mistake a second ago, sorry. Sulla came back, took the command back, then chased Marius away, then went to the east. Marius came back, started the slaughter, then Sulla came back and did his own slaughter. So I got that right.
Yeah.
The people's role is debated. People think, is it a democracy? Is it an oligarchy? One thing we know for sure is the vote matters. The vote is not rigged. It's not controlled. We know this because Cicero will write to us and be like, wow, the election was yesterday and so won. That was really shocking. Like no one thought that was going to happen, but here it is. So the elites don't control the vote exactly. They do to some degree, though. Voting is gerrymandered by wealth. The wealthiest people vote first, and their votes count more. And then, after a certain while, the very poor get to vote. But by then, the issue is usually decided.
Sort of like Hawaii, or
yeah, right. Well, the first in the nation, right? And so the idea is, how much control do they really have? Well, I think that the answer is voting matters. But the most important part for the competition is that voting is the judge of the competition. An aristocrat puts himself out and says, people, I should be consul. look at the wonderful things that I've done for Rome. I've conquered the various peoples. I've done these great things. I brought in a lot of money. Vote for me. And then the rival says, no, vote for me, and so forth. The people actually are the judge of the competition. Now, this is really important. We've all played sports. Okay, the point of the game is to win, but there's no point unless there's a referee, right? If there are no rules, there's no point to the game. The people are sort of the rules, right? The competition works only when someone judges it. But one of the things the Gracchi brothers did was say, we're on the side of the people. So the Senate now says, well, we don't trust the people anymore. We don't believe in their judgment. Well, now that the judge is gone, now the referee is gone, what's the point of the game? If you don't believe that the people's vote really, really matters anymore. This is all part of this mix of a loss of trust in how the system is supposed to function.
All right, so that's Sulla and Marius. And what did Catiline do?
Okay, Sulla and Marius
is relatively famous.
Yeah, Catiline, yeah. Sulla and Marius, after they do their slaughters and their liquidations of their enemies, the whole of the Roman society steps back for a moment and takes a breath for about 15, 20 years and says, look, that was really bad. Okay, what we just did there, that was terrible. We should never do that again. But at this point, and this is a point I made in the book we talked about before, all of the generation who were the last of the Republic, they're all teenagers during this time. They watch the slaughter in the streets. They're literally watching their fathers' heads being chopped off because they're the political enemies of so-and-so, and their heads are being put on spikes in the forum. It's dreadful. And all these young men are watching it happen. So for a while, they step back and they say, no, we can't act that way. But the psychological effect is buried deep within them. And Catiline is the first one of them who says, maybe I should be the boss after all. And he creates a conspiracy with a group of senators who were sort of disaffected by the fact that they have not gotten what they felt was their due. And he gives speeches to his followers, which may be true, maybe not. But again, the idea is that he says, look at these immoral, luxurious senators who are treating us like dirt. We should be on top because we come from illustrious families. We're not getting our due. And it's not because of sin or it's not because of whatever. It's because they don't follow the rules of restraint which make the Republic run. They are therefore bad people, but worse than that, they're destroying the Republic. And therefore, we are justified in killing them. So Catiline gets a group of followers together, hundreds, maybe even thousands when it comes down to it. And they form an army. And his plan is to murder the consul Cicero and his colleague in their beds. In fact, there's a great scene where, in fact, Cicero is warned by one of the wives of the conspirators, that the conspirators are coming after him. So he sets guards by his door when the conspirators come to greet him in the morning. They were going to do a Caesar on him. You know, good morning, Caesar, how are you? And then stab him. And then Catiline's defeated by the regular army. Cicero declares that he's the savior of the Republic and all this. But the simmering is there, right? The violence is ready. And this is the point. I hope everyone takes at least this away. It's like, how do you justify violence? You need some justification. Romans know that you can't just stab someone for the sake of stabbing them. Their justification is always, look at these immoral people who are treating the Republic badly because they are unrestrained. This is the repeat over and over and over and over again. It's the only language they know.
That's internal, but externally, these are barbarians, and therefore we should rule them.
Well, internally,
I mean, they use violence on all the time.
Look, if you want to go conquer other people, that's
not a problem.
That's not a problem. No, that's
not.
They're not Roman. They're barbarian. They deserve it.
Yeah.
So that's perfectly fine.
So then it's just internal.
This is all internal, right? We're asking, how did the Romans? They had no problem killing barbarians for the longest time.
Right.
How do they turn the violence in on themselves after hundreds of years of peace? And then why does it happen when it happens? And that, what I'm arguing is that it happens when the moral story they tell themselves becomes very complicated by the fact that now the commands are bigger, the wealth is bigger, all this stuff is bigger than it used to be. And people each think they're in the right. Correct.
And they're being restrained.
And they self-justify by saying, I'm the restrained one, you're the unrestrained one. This is the medium that allows them to justify. Let me make one other comment, because this is so important. I mean, many of you have probably read things out of Roman history. You know, they're obsessed with this. Or you read Sallust and Livy, and they're like, in the olden days, our ancestors were so morally upright, and they were restrained, and all of this is great, right? What you're seeing there is this mindset that this is how we're supposed to operate. And when Sallust, for instance, says, but after the fall of Carthage, everyone is acting badly, and morality is terrible, and we've all fallen in our moral state, what he's saying is not like Rome actually has fallen morals. He's a trace of an argument about what morality means. And he's saying everyone else is immoral but me. But he got kicked out of the Senate for being immoral.
Right.
And so he's just part of a conversation about what it means to be moral, but this conversation's deadly.
So what you're saying a little bit off the side is if they only knew the psychological theory about projection, that they would have all understood what they were up to.
Well, you hope they would listen, but no, there's a lot of projection, right?
Yeah.
Because again, what is every Roman boy told? Compete, win, and be the best, but do it according to self-restrained rules. But there's no dictionary definition of restrained, and so it's easy to say I am and you're not.
Right. All right, so Cicero, in one of his writings, and I think you quote him right near the beginning of your book, says, when things go wrong, none of this will stop a person from misbehaving. And he had a whole list of all the things that we do. Do you have that list?
It's the first passage. Here we go.
Yeah.
Neither reason nor moderation, nor law nor custom, nor duty has any strength, nor did the judgment and esteem of the citizenry, nor shame at what posterity will think.
Yeah.
None of those things are stopping the bad people from being bad.
Yeah, and it was disheartening to Cicero, obviously.
Yeah.
Just to bring that back to another point that you brought up earlier about the difference between our checks and balances, legal system and constitutional system. Obviously, if a custom can be broken, the laws can be broken. People can just say, well, that's not what that law means, or we can reinterpret it if we want to be subtle about it. But if we want to be blunt about it, we just say, well, who cares? We're just going to ignore the law. So it's an offense, a restraint, but it's not an impermeable barrier.
That's my frightened maybe, right?
Yeah.
That's we're not Rome, but people are people, and laws are as good as the people upholding them. So my day job is as a law professor, and I constantly tell my students, law is only as good as the people upholding it.
Yeah.
And we have to believe in it in order to make it work. And the moment we lose faith in it and say, well, I can't fix this by law, so let's do it by violence, then that's the frightening moment.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I won't go into it, Thomas More, who was a lawyer, talking to his son-in-law, said something very similar when he said the son-in-law wanted to reform religion. And More was against being that big of a reformist in spite of the fact that he was a utopian. But he said, and what are you going to do when you've broken down all the laws and then the devil has come, to see you,
Right.
And then you have nothing left to hide from. Of course, he himself had nothing left to hide from at the end of his life too. The law did not protect him either.
No, it is, and that's the frightening moment, right?
Yeah.
The moment when you start saying, I don't trust this is going to work for me anymore, so violence is my solution.
Right. Yeah, because the other side might figure that out too.
Well, that's also the problem, right? Is that in Rome, everyone has figured this out simultaneously. Yeah. And the violence, if you read the book, part one is kind of all about like how Roman structures and society works, and this is very interesting. But part two is the bloody, step by step. It's the real roaring story about how things go bad.
Yeah.
And it's kind of depressing to write, and I'm sure depressing to read about and then it just got worse, and then it just got worse, and then it just got worse, and so there's.
But then there was Augustus.
Well, but see, he's the authoritarian.
Yeah, absolutely, the authoritarian answer.
He no longer requires that sense of moderation from all of the aristocracy. He gets it from the people.
Right.
He tells the people, look how restrained I am. And boy, does he insist on that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And one of my favorite stories is he even says, all right, now, we're also all going to be restrained in bed. Nobody with anybody else's wife around here. And then he discovers that his daughter and granddaughter have multiple, and he exiles them.
Yeah.
Just to show that he means it.
Yep. They should have saw that coming. But yeah, it's fascinating. Like any culture, he's the leader in the culture at the end, and the republic is gone, and he's the authoritarian. He still uses the language of the republic. He still uses the cultural restraint of the republic. The culture hasn't changed. He just fits himself in there. But when we look back, we say, okay, that's
and
totally
he tried
different.
very hard to tell everybody, this is the republic. I'm a Republican. This is just the republic, like everything else, right? And he tried to use that language to show it.
Yeah. Yeah, all of us pigs are equal.
Yeah.
Some are more equal than others. So now we get to the story about that's most famous, and it's very interesting that Caesar, to me, Julius Caesar, has this image which doesn't seem to fit the facts at all. But we'll go into that a little bit later. But you make the interesting point that this whole generation around Caesar and the collapse of the Republic we're all influenced by all this violence that was taking place during the earlier time because they were children. So why don't you tell about the players there? And what?
Yeah, so Caesar's our main player. He's a teenager when Sulla is in power. Sulla spares his life. Caesar was about to get his head chopped off, and then some friends, the reason he was going to get his chopped off, he had married young, as Romans tended to do, teenagers. And Sulla wanted him to divorce the girl. Why, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, and Caesar said no. And Sulla was like, that's the wrong answer, young man. and we're gonna chop your head off. And friends had to, like beg for him, like he's just he's a boy, please let him go, but Caesar learned the lesson very quickly. It's like power is what matters, okay? And he developed a reputation, and whether it's merited or not, I can't tell you. No. It's irrelevant though, because what matters is the reputation, is that he developed a reputation for being flamboyant, for being deeply in debt, for being immoderate. Stories were told about him, some famous stories. He's 30 years old. He has some sort of middling job, boring office. He's traveling the world, and he sees a statue of Alexander the Great, who of course had conquered everything by the time he was 33 years old. And Caesar starts to cry. And his friends, what are you crying for? And he said, because he conquered the world at my age and I've done nothing, right? And so people marked in him this like extreme chip on his shoulder that made him a little bit sort of dangerous and immoderate, right? So by the time he gets to be available to be consul, he has a fairly good career. He's been a sort of a military hero. He actually won a great honor in battle. He saved a citizen's life, and he did all kinds of wonderful things. But people are very nervous about him. So nervous, in fact, that when he becomes consul, the Senate does something very unusual. Normally, when you become consul, the Senate sets up for the next year what the territory of the ex-consuls will be to command and control. So if you're the consul, they say, okay, next year the territory is going to be Greece. And you, the ex-consul, get sent to Greece, and you get to conquer, cool stuff over there. The next year for Caesar, they set up the woods and tracts of Italy. You get to repair the roads. And they did that because they were so nervous about him. Like, something's wrong with him. He's immoderate, he dresses funny. One of the things that Sulla said about him is, beware that ill-belted boy. Now, what's weird to us, what does that mean? He wore his toga very loose with a belt that was very loose. And this was like stylish. I don't know if there's like a modern equivalent of this.
I can think of one.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, wearing your pants down off your hips.
That's possible, yeah. Or even, I'm imagining the 50s, a kid shows up with bell bottoms.
Yeah.
Right? And they're like, something's wrong about that boy. Like, he's a little bit too something, he's not restrained, you understand, right? And so when Caesar becomes consul, they give him the woods and tracts of Italy. And this is deeply insulting to him because he wants a real command with real power, and no one trusts him with it because they think he's unrestrained. And so he's got another big chip on his shoulder. So he manages to get that changed to we know where, to Gaul, right, where he heads up to modern France and spends 10 years conquering France and some of England too. Comes back with massive loot, enormous amounts of loot. And his enemies at this point are terrified. Cicero writes, among other people, if Caesar comes back, he's going to kill us all, he's going to destroy the Republic, he's going to rob the temples, he's going to steal gold from the widows. For a person who's like a philosopher and fancies himself this deep thinker, Cicero has a real moment of like kind of panic, right? And it's moral panic, again, that Caesar is going to be a thief and he's going to be this immoderate person. I don't know whether Caesar intended it or not. But what matters is the Senate was nervous enough to say, you come back, and you come back by yourself. Not with your army, just you. And Caesar, of course, is like, I'm not doing that, because I'm not going to walk into my enemy's hands without protection. Now, of course, on the other side is Pompey, Caesar's great rival. And Pompey had spent his career doing more conquering than any person had to that point. He conquers the entirety of Asia Minor. He conquers the whole east of the Mediterranean. The reason that Judea is part of the Roman Empire, such that Christ is under the Roman rulers, is because Pompey had conquered that area. Down to Egypt he goes. He does all this incredible stuff. He thinks he should be the big boss and everyone should listen to him. So here's Caesar thinking that it should be his show, Pompey thinking it should be his show. You would think that would be enough. But they can't help themselves. They're constantly accusing the other of being immoral, licentious, luxurious, and all of those things. And I think it matters. The final piece that really matters is just as Caesar is getting into this big struggle with Pompey, a large number of junior senators are accused by one of the censors of being immoral and luxurious, right? And they're kicked out of the Senate. Well, rather than feel sorry for themselves and go, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, they just go over to Caesar. And they're like, well, if I'm going to get disrespected over here, I'll go hang out with this guy who respects me very much. And Caesar says, I'll take you guys on. And this is where we meet people like Mark Antony and this group of, this crowd of extremely loyal supporters, because this cleft has occurred in the aristocracy. And the dividing line is who's acting morally and who's acting immorally.
So someone should be out trying to collect moderate Republicans right now.
That's all I can tell you is that this feeling that if Caesar takes over, the Republic is done, and Caesar's followers feel that if he's not given his consulship, the Republic is rigged. And that's it. And that's the moment where they say, there's only one solution to our problem, and that's violence. And the whole last chapter is about every step of the way of their negotiations, how it seems like it might work, it might work, and then an accusation is given, but you're immoral, and then the deal's off the table.
Yeah. So one of the ideas that cover the range of things, then we'll get to the questions. You talk about an idea that people are willing to get enraged about, an idea in your culture which is so important that if people feel it's under attack, you're enraged about it.
Right.
Okay. So we have some of those ideas, but I think something like freedom of speech doesn't really rise to that level, other than Berkeley in the 1960s. That we talk about it, we say it's important, but people are quite willing to give up a lot in that area. So what idea do you think in our culture, right? And you say that in their culture it's the restraint thing. What is it in our culture that people are willing to get enraged about? Obviously, slavery was an idea that people did get enraged about. And
well, you stole my answer. But
yeah. Oh, sorry. But now, what's going on now? The remains of that enragement?
What a great question. So let me repeat something you said a second ago, because I think that's the key to this book, which is what causes violence? Ask the question, what norms or values violation is important enough to get violent over? In Rome, the answer is they had convinced themselves that restraint is what makes a republic run. They accuse each other of luxuriousness and all these terrible things. That's enough to get to violence. Slavery in our society, that was enough to get to violence. What now? Free speech, I think voting might get us there. If someone were to say no more voting, I suspect there might be violence from that. I think that's the core value that I think we would all share. I wish I shouldn't say wish, because that's the wrong thing to say. I think free speech should be more important in people's minds, that they should be not willing to give it up. But I think that voting would be the line that a lot of people would cross. Although I'm very curious what the audience thinks that line might be.
Well, we'll talk about it. Anybody that wants to also discuss an idea that they think in our culture might do that. So if you would say some other elements of what you learned about the Republic and what you think, because you disagreed with a lot of other people, a lot of other scholars that thought it was the luxurious wealth, it was this, it was that. Right. And you're saying, no, it's a cultural value that's really important. And I find that fascinating, because when there's enough wealth, I mean, we're a wealthy society, but we don't behave like it in a way. When I think about like the buildings that we build, we're not building anything architecturally that lasts, because it's not financially efficient and so on and so forth, because we approve of that financial efficiency, right? But when we were poor, we used to. Yeah, and it wouldn't be hard to switch that around and say we could make, we could use lasers to cut big granite things into buildings. We could do all kinds of things, but we don't do that. And it's interesting, because it's not like we're not out to leave a monument behind us, basically. But Rome was all about leaving a monument behind.
To yourself, usually.
Yourself, yeah. Maybe Trump Towers count. I don't know.
Well, the comment about the buildings is an interesting one, because there was a time when a value of the society was what we should spend our money on is an enormous library. that's beautiful and has stained glass and all stuff. We don't do that anymore, and it tells us what we value. We're far more individualistic, I think, than we used to be as a society.
Or cathedrals before that.
Or cathedrals before that, right. What do we spend
little villages built these cathedrals
Right.
that took them 1,000 years to build and took half their wealth. And they're absolutely gorgeous. But it's interesting that that's where the money went, yeah.
No, and your question prompts a lot of thoughts. It's sort of like, what do we value? Boy.
Do we value anything?
Well, no, and the turn to individualism is also
Yeah.
kind of a reflection on our culture as well.
Right.
I'm sorry, I had lost kind of the earlier point of your question because I got stuck on the building. So
Well, we'll just, just what is it that we value highly enough?
Yes.
And maybe it is individualism. Maybe that's part of it, because one of the things that sets America apart and has had a big influence, you talked about the competitiveness in Rome, and that the sons and the grandsons and everybody had to outdo their grandfathers. There haven't been a lot of cultures like that.
Right.
A lot of cultures, you're supposed to keep your head low until the other generation's gone, and then you can step forward. And if you do anything that makes them look bad while they're alive, that's losing face.
Right.
Right?
And
But America is definitely, you want your children to do better. I mean, not everybody, but that's a cultural value. You want your children to outdo you.
Right.
Even while you're alive, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, and highly individualistic in a way that Rome sort of was, and maybe the past in the United States wasn't. No, the question you'd ask is sort of like, what lessons did I take? And one is that narratives of decline are self-fulfilling, and the other is that Rome committed suicide. At the time the Roman Republic falls, it has no external enemies to speak of that are in any real danger to it. Internally, it has scads of money. There's vast inequality, but that's an issue that could have been fixed with a little bit of careful thought, right? There's no reason for the Republic to fall, none, except their own cultural choices. And that is what worries me. When I look at our country, is that there's no reason for us whatsoever to have the problems that we have if you just sit back and say, there's no external enemies. It's not as though we've been attacked and our economy has collapsed. As Abraham Lincoln says, if we are to die, it'll be by suicide. And you have to ask yourself, what are the cultural values that we're fighting over that might lead to our suicide? And that is what worries me a great deal. So that goes to your question, what is it? And I guess I cannot wait again for what people think, but I do worry that the individualistic streak in our society leads us to become far more emotional about our problems than we might otherwise be. We feel instantly offended in ways that we otherwise might not have been in a more communal society.
Could it be, just for everyone to think about, loss of control of our individual lives through maybe AI, the fear of AI, and that fear is extremely exaggerated, because there's always electricity, you can pull the plug on. So
until it starts making its own drones.
Yeah, exactly. but there's all kinds of issues of the concentration of wealth, et cetera, and power.
Right.
But there's always been that. It's always been, how much and how can you bring it back? As you said, in Rome, they could have just redistributed some of the land and not all of it, and so bring the inequality down. And with our tax, we already are redistributing money. We could do this in a very clear and efficient way, so that there was, well, let's not go into that.
No, I was going to say.
But there's lots of ways to deal with this problem from a legal point of view, as lawyers, of course, discuss. But
well, no, I firmly believe, and you can call me overly optimistic if you want, that there's not a problem that we face that we can't fix if we were to turn down the emotional, attachment to it. And the Romans simply could not turn off their emotional attachment to their problems. If they saw a problem, it was because someone was immoral. That was always the answer to them. And economists would say, no, this is like a distribution problem. Like, no, it's because someone's immoral.
Right.
Even if the barbarians invade, it's because General so-and-so was off steeping himself in luxury instead of paying attention to the borders. Every single time they come back to this as the explanation for their problems. And that's what causes the emotional fire every time they face a problem.
Interesting, because to me, the emotional fire ratcheted up with 9/11 and the fear that caused, that we are vulnerable when we thought we were invulnerable. And the language that was used at the time, terrible as it was, but it's unprecedented. This kind of attack and so on is unprecedented. But it was only, how many years? 60 years after World War II. And during World War II, that many people died every single day for 6 years in a row. You know, the 3,000, 4,000 people every day died for 6 years in a row. So unprecedented is not the right word to use for it, but it definitely gets the emotions going.
I would agree, and I think I would put into this book that same observation, which is the fall is psychological. It's a belief that causes fear, which causes anger, which causes violence. And the thing, if you're an American, you've got to ask yourself, where do I stop that process of fear turning into violence? And I try to tell my law students that the rule of law is one way to stave that off. It's not perfect. I certainly don't think it's perfect. I don't think the country's perfect in any way. We've got so many problems. But I think that turning the emotions down is one of the things that I took from this book, because when I see the end of this, I see a group of people who could solve their problems, but they're so worked up and terrified. And of course, the violence that they'd experienced as youths absolutely is helping to push that terror, but that's what's driving it, right? And you want to actually sit every single one of them down, give them a Xanax, and be like, look, you can get through this. If you really sit down and just relax for a minute. Caesar can be his consul for a year. He's not going to destroy the Republic. Caesar, they're not going to kill you. Just everyone chill. And I don't mean to be overly simplistic, because I don't want people to think that this is just the answer is everybody relax and be happy. That's not true.
Right.
But they could have faced their problems in a way that was not so emotionally fiery, such that violence appeared to be the justifiable response.
Yeah, and but you have to be very observant, because something like, you see people say, oh, why does anybody study literature, anybody study history, so on. It's like we have nothing to learn from the past. Well, we have tons to learn from the past. I know we don't learn from it very often, but there's lots of information there we could learn from. But the interesting thing is something much subtler than that, like people saying, you know, higher education isn't really financially worth it. You don't get your money back out of that, and it's true under certain circumstances. But you wonder whether that's an argument that's hiding a different emotion, which is, I don't want people to be educated. I want to tamp that down. I don't like that idea that everybody should be educated and therefore be a more informed citizen. I like it when we can get emotions going instead, you know, and that to me is the thing to watch for, because you know, that's we need as you said, a little bit of detachment. You don't have to be a philosopher. That's not necessary. But a little bit of detachment from the emotions that are being presented on a daily basis, and now in this enhanced method of getting to us with 2-second videos.
I worry because Cicero, to me, is such a cautionary story. I mean, this is one of the most brilliant human beings who ever lived. His philosophy, his writings, his ability, his translation ability. He's just a genius, really, in every way. And you talk about education. He's one of those highly educated people in the ancient world. And if you took that man today and just had his brain, he would be, you know, a brilliant scholar, you know, absolutely. And yet, at the end, he fell prey to it too. And so education is part of the answer, but it's also recognizing that even a highly intelligent person can fall into these traps.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, when I was reading that, I was like, come on, Cicero, I'm going to hold it together here, buddy. But you can see him kind of falling apart, right? And he's writing treatises to himself about, you know, there's no perturbation of the soul for the philosopher, and the philosopher is a person of no attachments whatsoever. And then he writes letters to his friend like, oh my God, Caesar's going to kill us all. And, and you wonder kind of, you know, can we learn to control those the lizard brain, basically. Like, you know, how do we turn down the lizard brain? Because it bears repeating. I mean, this is a story of the lizard brain.
You're not saying we're reptilians, I'm sure.
No,
Okay,
certainly not. No, when I say, I mean the amygdala.
I know what you mean.
You all know what I mean by this, right?
Sorry about that. Very bad joke, but we have a certain percentage of the population that.
Sure. No, what I mean, of course, is like the center of the brain that's the fight or flight reaction, right?
Yeah.
This is a story of the fight or flight reaction taking over, and the trigger is, ironically enough, the idea that self-control is important. Isn't that paradoxical if you think about?
Yeah.
You know, the Romans,
so human.
The Romans tell themselves, self-control is the key to good governance. And everyone's like, yes. And then that is the thing that runs the engine of their fight or flight reaction.
Yeah. And one last comment about your financial inequality issue. I think, as you said, it's the perception that the system is going to possibly work for anybody.
Yeah.
That's the most important. I mean, because that inequality there's always going to be a hierarchy. When I worked at a department store when I was in high school, I worked as a busboy in their restaurant. I got $1.10 an hour, and the cooks got $1.12 an hour, and the waitresses got $1.15 an hour plus tips, and the assistant manager was $1.25 an hour. The hierarchy was perfectly clear with just those increments of cents per hour of who was important and who wasn't important. And when I was working in Wall Street at a law firm, the increments were $25,000 between, this pay of this partner and this pay of the other partner and stuff like that. And it was all about where they fit in the system and not the amount. So a wealthier and wealthier society, we have to figure that out, it's great if everybody can live better. And whatever engine will drive that is a great idea, but we have to do something about the perceived fairness of the system so that everybody can get ahead that wants to, et cetera, et cetera. That's the crucial thing, because I don't think anything will ever happen to make it equal. As Mark Twain said, if you took all the money in the world and you spread it around so everybody had an equal amount, within 3 years it would all end up in the same hands it was in before they evened it out.
Yeah.
Because that's probably what happened. That's what happens in communist countries. It ends up in the leadership.
Yeah, I'll close with that, which is the fall is psychological. And psychology is not just your own beliefs. There's a reality behind it. And if people truly do not believe that they're getting a fair shake and have evidence of it, that's a frightening moment too.
Yeah. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 121st year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Paul.